Imagine commanding the most feared weapon in the world, only to watch it hunted down like an animal. German U-boat captains were stunned, claiming the enemy could see through the ocean itself. What invisible force shattered their dominance forever? The North Atlantic, March 1943. The sea was black as oil, restless under a steel-gray sky. Out of that darkness, a German U-boat broke the surface, gasping for air like a dying beast. Her diesel engines rumbled to life, but they were not alone. Above the waves, radar aboard an American Avenger aircraft pulsed in silence, its invisible beams sweeping the horizon. Within seconds, the hunter had found its prey. Flak gunners on the conning tower opened fire, desperate arcs of tracer rounds clawing at the sky, but the aircraft dove like a hawk, releasing its depth charges in a deadly pattern. Explosions tore the sea apart. Towering geysers engulfed the submarine. The pressure hull groaned, buckled, and when the smoke cleared, white flags waved from the shattered periscope. German sailors stumbled onto the deck, hands raised to surrender. Their fear was unmistakable. Only weeks earlier, these same gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine had ruled the Atlantic. Their wolfpacks struck fear into convoys, sinking ships faster than America and Britain could replace them. Winston Churchill himself admitted, the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Yet here, before the stunned eyes of both victors and prisoners, the roles had reversed. The predator of the Atlantic had become the prey. The myth of U-boat invincibility shattered in a single encounter. But this was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, where intelligence, radar, and relentless hunter-killer groups turned the ocean into a transparent battlefield. To understand how German captains, once feared as masters of the sea, found themselves shocked, outmatched, and hunted into extinction, we must turn back to the moment when America unveiled its most unexpected weapon. In the early months of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its darkest hour. Convoy routes stretching from North America to Britain were marked not by safe passage, but by burning wreckage. Oil slicks spread across the waves, lifeboats drifted aimlessly, and survivors clung to hope as the ocean claimed more lives each night. The weapon behind this devastation was the German U-boat, the Grey Wolves of Admiral Karl Dönitz. Their doctrine was as cold as the seas they prowled. Sink more tonnage than the Allies could build. Starve Britain of food, fuel, and weapons. And the island would collapse. By March 1943, the numbers favored Germany. Wolfpacks of coordinated submarines, sometimes 20, even 30 at a time, struck convoys with ruthless efficiency. That spring alone, over 500,000 tons of shipping were lost. By April, the figure rose even higher, more than 600,000 tons in a single month. To the men in London, the situation was dire. Winston Churchill later confessed, "The U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened me during the war." And he had reason. Dönitz commanded more than 400 submarines from his headquarters in occupied France. With each passing week, new boats slipped into service faster than they were destroyed. For Britain, the lifeline across the Atlantic seemed close to breaking. But war is never static. Beneath the surface of these grim statistics, a silent revolution was underway. In Washington and Norfolk, American naval strategists studied the mathematics of tonnage war and realized that defending convoys alone could not win. Escort destroyers could only react. They were chained to the merchantmen, forced to choose between chasing submarines or guarding their charges. What was needed was a force free of such burdens, a weapon built not to defend, but to hunt. Thus emerged the concept of the hunter-killer group. At its heart, a small escort carrier, not the mighty fleet carriers of the Pacific, but converted merchant hulls, modest in size, yet carrying a handful of aircraft capable of scouring hundreds of miles of ocean. Around the carrier, a screen of destroyer escorts armed with sonar, depth charges, and the newly developed Hedgehog mortar. Together, they would not wait for submarines to strike. They would go out and destroy them wherever they lurked. Technology made this vision possible. American laboratories had delivered centimeter-wavelength radar, invisible to German detection equipment. High-frequency direction finding, or HUF-DUF, could triangulate U-boat radio transmissions within minutes, and deep in the bomb bays of Avenger torpedo bombers. A secret weapon rested under a false name, the Mark 24 mine. In reality, it was the world's first operational acoustic homing torpedo. To the Germans, it would seem a wonder weapon, one that could hear the submarine itself. This fusion of intelligence, technology, and doctrine represented a turning point. For the first time in naval history, submarines would not be met with passive defense, but with organized, relentless pursuit. A doctrine born from desperation, soon to become the nightmare of every U-boat captain. And so, in the spring of 1943, as wolfpacks tightened their grip on the Atlantic, the first American hunter-killer group prepared to sail. The USS Bogue and her escorts left Norfolk Harbor, not to protect a convoy, but to hunt the hunters. When the USS Bogue slipped out of Norfolk in March 1943, she was not a warship in the traditional sense. At first glance, she seemed humble, almost unimpressive. Her flight deck stretched less than 500 feet. She carried just a dozen Wildcat fighters and 9 Avenger bombers. To the casual eye, this was no Titan of the seas. And yet, within her steel hull lay the seeds of a revolution. The escort carrier was born not from glory, but from necessity. America could not build fleet carriers fast enough to cover every ocean, but Liberty shipyards, churning out hulls at industrial speed, could be adapted. Merchantmen became carriers, modest, slow, but bristling with something far more dangerous than size: technology. The heart of this transformation was radar. Centimetric sets, operating at wavelengths invisible to German detectors, turned night into day. A U-boat surfacing to recharge batteries in the dead of night believed itself cloaked by darkness. But on the glowing green screens aboard an Avenger, it was outlined as clearly as a ghost under a searchlight. Then came HUF-DUF, high-frequency direction finding. Small, almost unremarkable antenna arrays mounted on destroyers, yet able to triangulate the position of a single German radio burst. And German doctrine required those bursts. Contact reports, weather transmissions, daily position signals, each message encrypted by enigma, but betrayed by physics. A whisper into the ether became a death sentence. The aircraft themselves completed the circle. The Wildcat fighter, rugged, dependable, escorted Avengers deep into the Atlantic. The Avengers carried depth charges, bombs, and something the Germans had never imagined. Officially designated the Mark 24 mine. In reality, an acoustic homing torpedo. It listened. It hunted. Once dropped into the sea, it followed the sound of propellers until it struck. The Allies concealed it under a false name, even in their own reports, to mask its true nature. To U-boat crews, it seemed supernatural. But these were not just machines. The hunter-killer groups demanded new kinds of sailors. Pilots trained to fly endless hours above a featureless sea. Radar operators who could distinguish a wave crest from a periscope mast. Destroyer escorts drilled in attack coordination, hedgehogs ready, depth charges set in lethal patterns. Every man had to trust the others completely, because unlike convoy escorts, they were alone. No merchant fleet to protect, no fixed route to follow. Their mission was singular. Find the enemy. Kill the enemy. The creation of these groups was fueled by intelligence as much as technology. In the halls of Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts bent over intercepted signals, deciphering the four-rotor enigma. In Washington, the newly established 10th Fleet coordinated submarine hunting with mathematical precision. Ultra-intelligence revealed refueling rendezvous, wolfpack assembly points, even individual patrol lines. To the hunter-killer groups, the ocean was not vast and empty. It was a map filled with targets. And beyond the calculations, there was a quiet confidence growing in American yards and bases. By 1943, the arsenal of democracy was in full stride. Escort carriers, destroyer escorts, aircraft, all pouring off assembly lines in numbers Germany could never hope to match. For every U-boat prowling the Atlantic, a new weapon waited to hunt it down. The men who sailed aboard these first groups did not yet know it, but they were at the edge of a transformation. For centuries, submarines had been shadows in the deep, predators hidden beneath the waves. Now, for the first time, an organized force had been built solely to seek them out. The hunter-killer groups had been forged, and soon, the Atlantic would become their hunting ground. The spring of 1943. The Atlantic was still a graveyard for Allied shipping. Convoys stretched in long, desperate lines, every freighter heavy with food, fuel, and weapons. Beneath them, the gray wolves prowled. To Admiral Karl Donitz, the balance still seemed favorable. His wolfpacks sank merchantmen faster than America could replace them. But the departure of the USS Bogue and her escorts would mark the moment when hunters became prey. At first, the missions felt routine. Pilots flew endless patrols over an empty horizon. Radar screens flickered with false echoes. Destroyers traced wide arcs, listening to the hum of the sea through sonar headphones. The ocean seemed too vast, too empty. Sailors joked nervously that perhaps the Germans had vanished into thin air. Yet deep down, everyone sensed the tension building. The U-boats were out there, waiting. On May 22, 1943, the waiting ended. Lieutenant William Chamberlain, piloting a TBF Avenger, caught a faint return on his radar, 18 miles east. A surfaced submarine, charging batteries in daylight. He pushed the stick forward. The big torpedo bomber thundered into its dive. Below on U-569, Captain Hans-Joachim Johansen heard the alarm bells ring. His boat had been at sea for 7 weeks, fuel running low, batteries drained, his men exhausted. As the Avenger screamed closer, Johansen ordered a crash dive. Ballast tanks flooded, diesel engines cut. The submarine tilted downward, desperately seeking the safety of depth. But safety never came. Chamberlain's depth charges erupted around the U-boat. The pressure hull shuddered, buckled, lights flickered out. Johansen had no choice. He blew ballast tanks. U-569 broke the surface, crippled. Another Avenger appeared overhead. And then, something no Allied airmen had yet seen. White cloth, German sailors waving surrender flags from the periscope shears. Moments later, as a Canadian destroyer raced to the scene, Johansen ordered the scuttling charges set. Explosions tore through the hull. U-569 slid beneath the waves. 25 men survived. 19 went down with their boat. For the first time, German sailors admitted shock. They knew exactly where we were, as if they could see through the ocean itself. The pattern repeated. In June, aircraft from Bogue caught U-217 on the surface west of the Azores. Captain Kurt Reichenbach Klinker fought desperately with deck guns. For 18 minutes, His crew hurled shells skyward, claiming one damaged Wildcat. But the ocean betrayed him. Depth charges bracketed his hull. The submarine broke apart, 50 men entombed in the deep. No survivors. The destruction of U-boats alone was devastating. But worse was the loss of the milk cows, the supply submarines that refueled and rearmed wolfpacks in mid-ocean. Without them, the reach of the U-boat arm shrank. In August 1943, aircraft from USS Card struck U-117 while she refueled another boat. Fuel hoses still connected. She was a sitting target. The explosion of 400 tons of diesel lit the night sky like a funeral pyre. Each sinking spread fear. German crews spoke of wonder weapons, American devices that found them no matter how they maneuvered. Morale eroded. Captains ordered radio silence, submerged transit, night-only recharges. But none of it mattered. The hunter-killer groups had learned the rhythm of submarine life. They timed their patrols to catch boats as batteries ran low, as desperation forced them to surface. By autumn, the ocean itself seemed alive with enemies. USS Card, USS Core, USS Santee. Each carrier group prowled its hunting ground with mathematical precision. Aircraft flew expanding box searches. Destroyers dropped dive markers to track diving subs. Pressure was relentless. Crews of the once proud gray wolves found themselves gasping for air, too afraid even to surface. The Atlantic had shifted. The wolfpacks no longer stalked convoys with impunity. They were stalked in return. One U-boat ace, upon barely surviving an attack, muttered to his fellow officers, "The Atlantic has become a slaughterhouse." For centuries, the sea had been the submarine's shield. Now, it was turning into its cage. The autumn of 1943. The Atlantic no longer belonged to the gray wolves. Yet the true measure of reversal came not only in statistics, but in the raw brutality of battles, where men and steel collided in ways no doctrine had foreseen. These were not silent hunts beneath the waves. They were savage, chaotic encounters, where submarines and surface ships fought at point-blank range, clawing at each other like beasts in the night. On the evening of October 31st, 1943, the USS Bogue prowled the North Atlantic under Captain Charles Hutchins. Radar had picked up a contact, U-405. Lieutenant Commander Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, a seasoned U-boat officer, was caught on the surface in heavy seas. Hauptmann tried to dive, but depth charges forced him back up. In the storm-tossed darkness, the destroyer escort closed the distance. At 21 knots, the Bogue slammed into the submarine. Steel shrieked against steel. The American warship's bow rode up onto the deck of the U-boat. For minutes, the two vessels were locked together, rolling in the swells like wrestlers unable to break free. At such close range, conventional weapons became almost absurd. Sailors fired pistols, rifles, even flares across the narrow gap. German gunners hurled grenades. American sailors responded with machine guns, shotguns, even empty shell casings and coffee mugs. One officer recalled the surreal moment. It was as though the sea itself had gone mad. When the ships finally tore apart, the Bogue brought all her guns to bear. Over 4,000 rounds pounded U-405. The submarine's conning tower was shredded, its deck guns silenced, its pressure hull torn open. Hauptmann ordered his men to abandon ship. As the survivors struggled in the freezing waves, U-405 slipped beneath the surface. Only 8 of 49 men survived. Hauptmann himself went down with his boat. The Bogue, too, was mortally wounded. Hours later, she was scuttled. It was a victory bought with blood. A clash unlike anything the Atlantic had seen. Just months later, another encounter would push the surreal into the unthinkable. On May 6, 1944, the USS Buckley closed in on U-66 west of the Cape Verde Islands. Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel guided his ship through the night, guided by radar. The submarine, commanded by veteran Oberleutnant Gerhard Zeuhausen, had sunk more than 30 ships. But years of experience meant nothing now. With batteries exhausted, U-66 could not dive. The German captain chose desperation. He tried to ram the American warship. At 15 knots, steel met to steel. The Buckley's bow ground up against the submarine's hull. Men shouted over the roar of impact. Once more, the fight devolved into madness. Sailors from both sides fired pistols and submachine guns across the decks. Grenades flew. American sailors threw shell casings, knives, even coffee mugs. In the chaos, the Buckley's gunners loosed over 2,000 rounds. The submarine's hull was shredded, punctured in dozens of places. Flames burst from the conning tower. Finally, the U-boat rolled, broken, and slipped beneath the Atlantic. 24 of her crew perished with her. The survivors described the scene as a nightmare of fire and steel. But perhaps the most symbolic of all these clashes was not destruction, but capture. On June 4, 1944, aircraft from the USS Guadalcanal crippled U-505 off the coast of Africa. Destroyer escorts moved in, depth charges hammering the boat until she was forced to surface. Her captain, believing the submarine doomed, ordered the crew to abandon ship and set scuttling charges. Men scrambled into the water, but American boarding parties, braving gunfire and flooding, leapt onto the U-boat's deck. They descended through the conning tower. Water poured through shattered valves. Alarms wailed. In the choking darkness, they sealed bulkheads, closed vents, and stopped the sinking. For the first time in the war, an intact German U-boat fell into Allied hands. The intelligence value was immeasurable. Code books, Enigma machines, acoustic torpedoes, technical manuals, all captured. But beyond the documents, the psychological shock was profound. The Grey Wolves had not only been destroyed, they had been taken as trophies. To many U-boat sailors, this moment symbolized the end. The hunters had been stripped of their mystique, dragged into daylight. The climax of the hunter-killer campaign was not measured in tonnage charts, but in the despair echoing through German radio traffic. Captains spoke of enemies who appeared everywhere at once. Crews became too afraid to surface, even when oxygen thinned and batteries died. In October 1943 alone, 23 submarines were lost. Among them were veterans who had hunted since 1939. Each sinking was more than a ship. It was irreplaceable experience. By late 1943, the psychological shift was irreversible. No longer did submariners speak of hunting convoys. They spoke only of survival. Patrol logs carried grim lines. "We are not hunters. We are the hunted." One commander called the Atlantic a slaughterhouse. Another confessed to interrogators. "The ocean itself betrays us." For the men inside the steel hulls, life became a countdown. Hours submerged until batteries ran out. Minutes on the surface until aircraft appeared. Every decision weighed between suffocation below or annihilation above. Even victories turned hollow. On April 24, 1944, U-546 torpedoed and sank the destroyer escort, USS Frederick C. Davis. But within hours, she too was hunted down and destroyed by the remaining escorts. 46 men lost with her. It was a duel where even success ended in death. The decisive tragedies of these encounters revealed a new truth. Submarine warfare, once cloaked in stealth and daring, had become brutally exposed. The wolfpacks were no longer hunters of convoys. They were prey for a machine of war that never tired, never relented, never stopped. For German U-boat captains, the shock was total. They had entered the war believing themselves an elite force, striking fear across the seas. Now, They watched their boats shattered, their crews annihilated, their very weapons captured. The climax of the Battle of the Atlantic was not a single victory, but the relentless realization that the tide had turned forever. The winter of 1943 into 1944 revealed the full weight of reversal. The Atlantic, once ruled by the gray wolves, had become a killing ground. Every month, the arithmetic of destruction grew more grim. In 1942, German submarines had sunk over 1,000 Allied ships. By 1944, that number had fallen by nearly 90%. The hunters of the deep were being extinguished. For the men who served aboard U-boats, the consequences were catastrophic. Of 40,000 submariners who went to sea, 30,000 never returned, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of the German armed forces. To walk into a U-boat school in 1944 was to walk into a morgue in waiting. Entire graduating classes vanished within weeks. Young men, scarcely out of adolescence, were sent on their first and last patrols. The scale of loss was staggering. 784 U-boats destroyed. Bases in France bombed into rubble. Fuel supplies dwindled. Training shortened to the point of futility. By the final year of war, the average age of a U-boat commander had dropped to just 26. Some captains barely 23. They lacked the hard-earned instincts of veterans. They sailed steel coffins into an ocean that had become transparent to Allied eyes. The death of Admiral Karl Dönitz's own son underscored the futility. Peter Dönitz, serving as a watch officer on U-954, was killed when the boat was sunk with all hands in May 1943. Even the architect of the submarine campaign could not shield his family from its collapse. Yet the orders continued. More crews dispatched, more lives consumed. It was not strategy anymore. It was sacrifice. Allied dominance was not only measured in combat, it was written in the factories. American shipyards launched over 100 Liberty ships each month, nearly 3 every 2 days. Each carried 10,000 tons of cargo. The math of tonnage war, once favoring Germany, had turned hopeless. For every Allied ship destroyed, 3 more rose from the slips. For every submarine lost, Germany struggled to replace even one. The psychological toll deepened the tragedy. Survivors pulled from sinking boats spoke of despair. "The ocean has become a trap," one admitted. "We cannot hide. We cannot run. We cannot fight." Fear spread through the fleet. Captains cut transmissions to mere seconds, but even that betrayed them. Refueling was restricted to the dead of night, but aircraft with new radar still found them. Crews surfaced only to gasp for air, only to find Avengers circling overhead. By mid-1944, the very tactics that had once promised victory had become suicide. The wolfpack doctrine collapsed. No longer did groups of submarines converge to overwhelmed convoys. Instead, lone boats crept into the Atlantic, hunted from the moment they left port. Many never reached their patrol zones. The human cost was relentless. In November 1944 alone, 24 boats were lost. In December, 27. By the final winter of war, crews spoke openly of doom. Patrol orders were received like death warrants. Families watched sons and fathers march away, knowing the odds of return were less than half. For Germany, the consequences reached beyond numbers. The U-boat arm had once symbolized strength, daring, and the promise of victory through stealth. By 1945, it symbolized futility. A force bled white, bases abandoned, survivors broken in body and spirit. What had begun as the terror of the Atlantic ended as systematic extermination. The hunter-killer groups had achieved not just tactical success, but strategic annihilation. The balance of the Atlantic was decided. The convoy sailed with growing confidence. Britain's lifeline, once frayed and near breaking, now pulsed stronger than ever. The nightmare of the U-boat had been ended, and the gray wolves were gone. In the spring of 1945, as black flags rose above the conning towers of surrendering U-boats, the Atlantic lay quiet. The once feared gray wolves returned not as predators, but as prisoners. Out of more than 1,100 submarines commissioned by Germany, nearly 800 had been destroyed. Their wrecks carpeted the seabed, rusting monuments to a war lost beneath the waves. The legacy of this campaign was not simply in numbers. It was in the transformation of warfare itself. For centuries, the ocean had been a shield, a vast wilderness where stealth and daring could tilt the balance. The U-boat embodied that tradition. Small crews, elite commanders, striking unseen. But the hunter-killer groups shattered that illusion. They proved that courage and skill alone could not overcome systematic superiority. What won the Atlantic was not chance, but method. Radar that pierced the dark. Direction-finding stations that triangulated a whisper. Aircraft that patrolled for hours above an empty horizon. Escort carriers that brought the reach of land-based air power deep into mid-ocean. And intelligence. Decoding enigma, revealing patrol lines before a submarine ever sailed. Each element was powerful. Together, they were devastating. From that fusion of technology, intelligence, and industry, modern anti-submarine warfare was born. The Cold War would inherit these lessons. Nuclear submarines, sonar nets, maritime patrol aircraft, all owed their doctrine to the experiments of the hunter-killer groups. The integration of sea and sky, the marriage of science and tactics, the relentless application of pressure. This became the blueprint for future generations. Yet the legacy was not only strategic, it was profoundly human. Of 40,000 German submariners, 30,000 never returned. Young men, often no older than 20, marched into steel coffins. For them, the ocean was not a battlefield of glory, but a grave. Their sacrifice testified to the brutal efficiency of industrial war. Against a system of overwhelming power, individual bravery could not prevail. Admiral Dönitz, who once believed the U-boat could strangle Britain into surrender, admitted the truth after the war. "We were not defeated by better sailors," he wrote, "but by better systems." His words captured the essence of the legacy. The Battle of the Atlantic was not only about ships and submarines, it was about the dawn of a new era, when science, mathematics, and production lines decided survival. Today, the wrecks lie silent on the seabed. Their steel dissolves slowly into the abyss. But their story endures. The gray wolves who once terrorized the seas were undone, not by chance, but by transformation. The Atlantic had become transparent. The hunters had been hunted. And in that transformation, history itself had shifted. It was no longer the age of the lone wolf commander. It was the age of systems, the age of relentless, methodical war. An age that defined not only the Atlantic, but the future of every ocean to come.